Do you ever wonder if Jesus really understands you? I mean, he's God. How could he really understand what you're going through? Today, we're going to find out that he, more than anyone, knows what you go through. I'm Nate Carter, and today I'm here with you with our Cornerstone Connection daily devotional. And we are in Mark chapter 14 today. And I want to look through this chapter together with you because in this chapter, I see it as just a wonderful example of humanity. I mean, you just see humanity in all its characteristics throughout the section that we're going to be in today. So let me just take you on a little journey through a few verses in Mark chapter 14. The first thing that we see in the passage that we're in today that begins with verse 26, Jesus is on his way. He knows that this is his last couple of hours before he's going to be arrested and then executed. And he's with his disciples, and he's telling them what's about to happen. And he predicts that the disciples are going to desert him. And the first element of humanity that we see is in Peter in verse 29 when he says, "Even if everyone else deserts you, I never will." And we see in this our nature as human beings to claim things that are beyond our control, to think that we have the complete mastery over our situation, even over ourselves. Peter's making a promise that he just can't keep. And Jesus responds and says, "You know what? You're going to deny me even tonight." And Peter says, "Never. I won't do it." And we see in here the frailty of humanity, the inability to keep our promises. Later in verse 37, Jesus has gone away to be by himself, and he's asked the disciples just to stay up with him. And you see in this just Jesus' desire to be surrounded. You see the humanity of Jesus. He's fully human as well as fully God. And you see the desire of him to be surrounded by his friends during this hardest hour of his life. And yet in verse 37, he finds the disciples asleep, and he actually calls out Peter. He says, "Simon, are you asleep? Couldn't you watch with me even 1 hour?" And we see once again the frailty of humanity that Peter can't even control, can't even keep himself awake at the most important moment of his Savior's life. And then in verse 43, we see another really despicable part of humanity. We see this crowd of men armed with swords and clubs, and you just see the anger and vitriol, the desire to conquer, the desire to kill as they are going after Jesus to arrest him. Once again, a chapter that is devoted to humanity. And then in 47, one of Jesus' own disciples, I think in another gospel, we find out that it's Peter, pulls out a sword and strikes the high priest's slave, slashing off his ear. And in this case, we see humanity once again. We see Peter's inability to control himself, and he loses control, and he strikes another. So another example. And then finally in verse 50, we see that the disciples run and they desert Jesus. Again, human weakness, the inability to be with Jesus at his time of greatest need, and Jesus is left alone. Now, before we end, I want to point out one other element of humanity. As I mentioned before, Jesus is fully God, but also fully man, fully human. And we see some elements of his humanity in verse 34, where Jesus is praying, and it's this last time alone with the Father in prayer, and he cries out and he says, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death." And then later in verse 36, it says he's praying and he says, "Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Please take this cup of suffering from me." And in those two verses, we see Jesus he's broken. We see that he's fully human, just like us. He's broken. He's saying, "I need you." First of all, he says to the disciples, "I need you. Keep watch with me. I'm alone. I'm scared. I don't want to do this." And then he says the same thing to the Father. "I don't want to do this. Do we have to do this? Do we have to go through with this crucifixion? You can take this cup of suffering away from me if you want to, but then Jesus says, 'Yet I want your will to be done.' and not mine. And we see this wonderful example of a human crying out to his God, to his Father, to our Father, to say, please take this away from me. Yet whatever you want to be done, I will submit to it. I love this chapter because it just points out the rawness of humanity, both exemplified by Jesus' disciples and the crowd against him, but also in Jesus himself. If you ever wonder if Jesus understands you and understands your predicament, this is a wonderful reminder that Jesus was fully human, and that he experienced all the trials and tribulations, actually even more so than we do. If you're in need of him right now to understand you, to walk with you in your suffering, know that he does, and he has. I hope that encourages you today. We'll see you next time on the Cornerstone Connection.